Welcome to today's Explainer. We're about to completely change how you view the ocean. Seriously, we're going to look closely at the fascinating science of fear, sensory processing, and what exactly happens to your brain when you jump into the deep end. Okay, let's dive right into this. When you think of deep water, what is the absolutely most terrifying part? Be honest with yourself here. Most of us instantly picture giant sharks circling below, or maybe the sheer, crushing darkness of the abyss, right? We think our fear is entirely based on these visual threats because, well, that's what pop culture has trained us to look out for. And this is wild. According to the research, it's not what you see that's the primary trigger for your panic. It's actually what you don't hear. The true antagonist in deep water, the real hidden driver behind all that anxiety, is silence. Your brain is freaking out not because of some sea monster, but because someone literally just hit the mute button on your entire environment. So, let's put a clinical name to this whole thing. Thalassophobia is an intense fear of deep water, and it's often driven by a lack of sensory input and your brain's reaction to unfamiliar silence. And I absolutely love pointing this out because it validates exactly what you might be feeling. If you're afraid of deep water, you're not suffering from some silly, irrational panic. Your fear is a perfectly rational, biological response rooted in how the human brain interprets sensory info. Your body evolved to detect danger, so when you take away its favorite tool, sound, of course it naturally goes on high alert. Now, what's really interesting about this is the stark contrast. On land, your brain relies heavily on continuous auditory feedback. Even when you aren't actively paying attention, you hear the wind moving through the trees, distant traffic, bugs, maybe the low hum of your refrigerator. These are constant, subconscious cues telling you, hey, everything is normal, you are safe. Now consider deep water. The absolute moment you submerge, those familiar sounds are just gone. Directional hearing becomes entirely distorted because sound actually travels through your body completely differently underwater. You lose all your familiar reference points and experience this sudden, drastic sensory deprivation. It's like a shock to the system. So that brings us to Section 1, Evolutionary Roots and Sensory Distortion. Consider this insight from the source material. Silence is rarely neutral to the human brain. It is often interpreted as a signal that something is unknown or unpredictable. Think about our ancient ancestors for a second. For them, a sudden drop in ambient noise usually meant a predator was creeping into the area or prey animals were fleeing. Silence meant danger. It was a vital survival mechanism. The fascinating and, let's be real, sometimes frustrating thing is that today, that exact same ancient survival mechanism triggers even when you're just floating in a perfectly safe, completely empty swimming pool. And it's not just the mere absence of sound. There's a reason why underwater silence feels so heavy or even suffocating. First off, you have increased physical pressure on your ears and chest, which literally makes the silence feel like an external force closing in on you. Second, without sound or clear visuals, you lack external boundaries. You just kind of feel like you're floating in an endless void. And third, and this is a really big one, internal amplification. Because the outside world is muted, your brain just cranks up the volume on your internal world. You become hyper-aware of your own heartbeat, your breathing, even tiny muscle movements. That heightened internal awareness can feel incredibly intense, and honestly, pretty weird if you aren't used to it. Moving on to Section 2, the anxiety feedback loop. Let's move to how this builds, because what happens when all these distortions combine is a self-reinforcing cycle of panic. Step 1, you notice the absence of sound. Step 2, your brain immediately interprets this as uncertainty. Step 3, your physical stress response kicks in. Your heart rate shoots up, your muscles tense. Step 4, you enter that state of hyper-awareness we just talked about, making the silence feel way more intense. And finally, Step 5, escalating panic. Since sound can't verify your safety, your imagination just takes over completely. You start thinking, oh man, something is right below me and I am completely exposed. Your brain essentially uses your imagination to frantically fill the gap left by that missing audio. And to compound the whole issue, keep this number in mind. 2. That is the number of major reference points your brain loses almost entirely underwater. You lose reliable sound, and because light diminishes so quickly below the surface, you also lose clear sight. Losing 2 of your primary senses at the exact same time, that causes severe disorientation. This brings us to Section 3, the reframe, taking control. So how do we fix this? To beat this ancient anxiety loop, the first tool we have is a nervous system regulation technique called the breath anchor. When you're underwater, you need to make your own breath your primary reliable sound. The pattern is super straightforward. Inhale for 4 seconds, hold for 2 seconds, and exhale for 6 seconds. Notice how that exhale is a bit longer? Well, that's completely deliberate. Physiologically speaking, longer exhales naturally calm the stress response. By focusing on the rhythm and sound of your own air moving, you create this steady, predictable anchor that cuts right through the uncertainty of the silence. And this brilliantly illustrates our next tool, reframing your internal language. When panic starts to set in, notice what you naturally think and consciously reframe it. Instead of thinking, wow, this is terrifying, tell yourself, this is quiet. Instead of, I am completely exposed, remind yourself, I am safe and in control. Instead of, this feels wrong, shift it to, this is still. By simply changing the words you use in your own head, you directly change your brain's perception of silence. It goes from an unpredictable threat to a perfectly neutral state. Remember, language literally shapes perception. Now, for those wanting a more comprehensive path, the source material highly recommends a structured system called the Aqua protocol. This focuses on a few key areas: understanding your specific fear triggers, using step-by-step exposure techniques, mastering that breathing and nervous system control we talked about, and applying those mental reframing strategies. The main takeaway here is that progress requires controlled exposure, not just random forced panic. You might start by just sitting by a quiet pool, then maybe just submerging your ears briefly. You're building familiarity gradually so your brain actually learns, deep down, that silence does not equal danger. So the crucial point is that you don't just jump straight to the finish line. Overcoming this phobia follows a really clear timeline of repetition and reframing. You start at stage 1, fear, where the silence feels totally overwhelming. Then, through controlled exposure and breath anchoring, you reach stage 2, neutral. Here, the silence feels unfamiliar, sure, but entirely manageable. Finally, you hit stage 3, calm. At this stage, silence actually feels peaceful and controlled. Professional swimmers and freedivers don't just tolerate silence, they actively train to prefer it as a space for mental clarity. Which brings us to the end of our explainer today, and I really want to leave you with this final provocative thought. If silence isn't actually a threat, what could you discover if you finally listen to the stillness? What once felt like a terrifying, suffocating void can actually be transformed into an ultimate tool for peace, focus, and internal awareness. Next time you're in the water, don't run from the quiet. Anchor your breath, change your words, and just listen. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and I'll see you next time.